we've been living through and experiencing the pandemic of inequity, right, for decades upon decades. Why do you think that politicians can seem to get away with the "we could have never known" narrative?
Simply because they've been able to. White supremacy rules everything around us, and there are people who are not white who actively uphold white supremacy, many of them quite intentionally. And the stakes for politicians as it relates to Black folks have been higher than they realize, because if you look at the Democratic Party, and that Black people, Black women in particular, have been our most loyal base, and yet, or have been their most loyal base and most consistent and important base, and a base that has decided national and local elections without being super served, right? Without being paid adequate attention or being centered in policy, in presence, in so many ways. And yet we've continued to deliver. However, what we haven't seen is an increase in Black voters that we should be seeing, considering the threat that exists against us from the other side. But there are so many people that are like, look, what would compel me to engage with this process if being loyal to this party has not delivered upon any concrete action, or that if these particular conditions have continued to exist? When people who are new to politics, who are new to the conversations that we're having now, find out that the presumptive Democratic nominee wrote the crime bill, that is a cornerstone of mass incarceration, right? And so there should have long since been a call on the left, on the Democratic Party, to address the needs and concerns of Black people, to say we see them, to say we recognize them. And at times they have, but we've seen a lot of lip service. We've seen policies that didn't go far enough. We've seen concessions. We've seen a fear of alienating white voters who have been quite clear where they stand and with whom they stand. Women who are willing to vote against what many would think are their best interests, right, in the name of white supremacy. But out of, I think there are plenty of institutions and politicians, individual politicians, local parties that do recognize the threat and the trauma and the complicated nature of the existence of Black life in this country, but have chosen not to prioritize addressing our issues, or to go slow, or to go for low-hanging fruit, things that won't offend people, because the concern is not making us whole. The concern has not been ensuring that we are treated with dignity, or that we receive reparations, or that we are, adequately tended to as citizens of this country who participate in every level of the political process and should be acknowledged as such, but instead to not offend white folks, to not scare other people away. And that's been to their detriment.
It always seems like the true goal is never to, give too much as to not offend white people, right? Like it's so, I get so pissed off because the Republicans bend over backwards for white evangelicals, right? Like they give them everything. They do everything, because that is their base, right? They don't look to expand their tent, God knows, because they don't care. Democrats, knowing that Black people are their base, knowing particularly that Black women are their base, we get nothing, because the attitude has always been like, oh, where are you going to go? But the result of where you're going to go has people stay home, because what's the point? Right? Like what's the point, like you say, of entering into a process that does not see me, that doesn't offer me anything? I want to talk to you a bit about, some celebrities that have been speaking out over the past several days, but also many of them over the past, many years. Diddy being the first one that I kind of want to talk about, because he has come out, and this was before the interview with Joe Biden and Charlemagne the God. He came out and said essentially that the Black vote is not free, that like Joe Biden and Democrats need to get themselves together because this vote is not going to be free. of course, we know what Joe Biden's response to that and what his response was to Charlemagne the God. What do you make of Diddy's statement? He is the originator of, vote or die and trying to get folks registered to vote. What do you make of his statement to Joe Biden and to Democrats as a whole?
I mean, I think it is fair to say that the Black vote is not free. I also think that acknowledging that there are Black people who have voted for what they see as the lesser of two evils doesn't mean that the vote has been entirely free, that the vote for a Democratic candidate so often has been, and at times a begrudging decision, but one that was made with our best interest in mind. And so with that, yes, it is absolutely beyond past time for us to be asking that with this vote, yes, you may recognize that you represent a better outcomes for us or for many of us than the other side of the aisle, but you don't represent enough change, right? That's why there's uprisings in the street. That's why people are enraged. That's why, things like the murder of Breonna Taylor and of George Floyd and so many others before them and after them has been able to persist because the party that we have aligned ourselves with has not taken adequate steps to meet our needs. I think it's also important that when celebrities engage in political talk, that they are aligning themselves with experts, with organizations that have been doing the groundwork for many years. I admire and honor the excitement that Diddy and others have in this moment, and that I've seen him saying, I want answers. I'm looking for, that it doesn't seem to be coming entirely from a place of I know what we should do, but like looking for solutions and trying to figure out who to work with. And I just hope that he and others stay on that path, as opposed to kind of deciding that because we are the voices, of the culture in so many ways, because we are visible, that we're going to simply tell you, and these kind of, very talking points that hold meaning but can ring empty if they don't go beyond the Black vote is not free, right? So what does that mean? What are the demands that we are putting forth in front of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party? Are we demanding a different candidate? What is it that we are asking for in this moment? And what are we prepared to deliver on in order to receive that? And what are we prepared to withdraw? Is it our vote? Is it our participation in this process? Is it our money? Are we not going to work? Are we not going to spend money with big corporations? Are we going to do that for a day? Are we going to do an economic boycott for a month? It is high past time for there to be consequences for not doing right by Black people. And I think that is the spirit of his statement.
Some people have said, you make your demands known before there's actually a selection, right? So essentially, Joe Biden is our presumptive nominee, right? He is our nominee. Yeah. And the feeling is that why didn't we make our demands known before he was the nominee? Because frankly, when you look at the pool of candidates, if we go back to when our biggest problem was the 2020 election, when we look at that, there were other candidates that had agendas for the Black community, real ones with real policies. And Biden wasn't one of those people. He's come up with the 22-page plan now after the fact, but he didn't originate with that. What do you make of the fact that there should be no presumption of nomination without the explicit signing on the contract to Black people, like I will do better and these are what my policies look like? What do you make of that?
I think that, overwhelmingly Americans are not well educated about the political process. We learn very cursory information in school about how to vote. Even many of us who were brought to the polls by our parents as children, watch them vote, understand that we have a responsibility to vote, don't adequately and effectively engage with the entirety of the process, which means the local elections, which means the down ballot races that, have a tremendous impact on your life, on your day-to-day life that you may not be thinking about. as opposed to simply showing up every 4 years when there's a big presidential election. And with that, I think that, how do I want to put this? There were certainly candidates that had what I thought to be impressive plans for Black America. I was an Elizabeth Warren surrogate, very proudly.
I was for her. I wasn't a surrogate, but I was so in the bag for her. Yeah.
And it was a complicated decision to make, considering all the people who were in the race, but it was one that I made confidently. I also know that her campaign, like others that I would have loved to have seen go all the way, as opposed to the current presumptive nominee, that failed to adequately engage Black voters on the ground, right? So many campaigns were so deeply invested in Iowa, but not in South Carolina, right? Not in Michigan. So you can have all the great plans in the world for Black folks, but you can't only be having those conversations on Black Twitter, because that is not where the entirety of the Black voter base lies. It's an important place to be. It's a place where ideas can be workshopped and refined and spread to important voices, with audiences of 3 and audiences of 3 million, but it is not a substitute for being in the trenches and being in the streets. And Joe Biden was the most famous candidate. Right? That's something that we have to think about. That is a factor, that he was Barack Obama's vice president, and he feels like a safe bet for a lot of people. And there are folks who are like, I don't have time to mess around with this, hope and change shit. If Donald Trump is going to be, the president of the United States again. I mean, and I think that the fear that would lead someone to say during the primaries, this is when you're supposed to have your say. Right? Like, you can feel that way, just as I voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary, right? Like, that was my candidate. And I knew that Hillary Clinton would take it, but I preferred Bernie Sanders. And when the general election came around, I voted for Hillary Clinton, but when you have that opportunity to say who has the best vision for me, you can only adequately answer that question when you've seen the vision.
Yeah.
And if you have only seen Joe Biden, who was aligned with a very popular, well-liked Black candidate or Black president, it's not terribly surprising that so many people simply took what they may have thought to be the safest bet. And again, it's, and as much as, and then there are people that were like, he's talking about socialism, she's talking about billionaires, and I just don't see this working out. I think they're too far left. There were certainly people who had that attitude. There are also people who just simply did not know them. Right? We know that there's bias in media coverage. We saw how, as Warren trended upward in the polls,
never saw her on mainstream media.
Didn't see her on mainstream media. It was like she was just erased from the campaign, and the focus was on Bernie and Biden. And there were times where the focus was put on Bernie because there was something salacious or provocative or, potentially controversial. There were times where Biden should have been covered and he wasn't. There were things, there were scandals and accusations that were not treated seriously until essentially it was quote unquote too late. And now there's only this one candidate in the race. And we should know this by now.
Yep.
We should know that if, Joe Biden had a virtual town hall with mayors from across the country the other day talking about the uprisings. The major, it did not get the sort of major network coverage that Donald Trump would have gotten as a candidate had he held a rally with mayors. Right?
Yeah.
Part of the reason that he was so successful in 2016, obviously there was a lot of factors at hand.
All the free coverage. All of the free coverage. He didn't have to pay for a narrow television ad because of how the cameras just followed his plane, followed his every step, his every mood. And it's just like, if everybody that was running for office was given that amount of airtime, then maybe our democracy would look different,
Right. Absolutely. And I think that, what's unfortunate is Donald Trump still enjoys that sort of airtime. There's a very different bend to the coverage now. You're seeing outlets that are beginning to deliver, that are making the decision to turn against him, not necessarily in the sense of owning their journalistic bias, but recognizing that this person represents a threat to their institution and to the nation, and that they're presenting that information. But that was the truth of him before. So
right.
if you wanted to, they could have had a Trump-filled news cycle in 2016 that focused on sexual assault allegations, that focused on racial discrimination in housing, that focused on, the allegations that have been made of abuse by his ex-wife. There was no shortage of awful things to be reported about Donald Trump and the failure of so many of his businesses. But instead, he was treated as this entertaining character. America loves a show, and they sure got one. And so what burns me about 2020 and to see these campaigns, a few of which I truly did believe in and would have been happy and enthusiastic about supporting going into the general election, is that knowing that they still didn't have the ground game. And it's more than just saying we didn't have the money, we didn't have the resources, because there were so many people that were excited and engaged in the Sanders campaign that had the money, that had the resources, that could have, created or developed a platform or platforms to amplify his messaging and to demystify what democratic socialism was, and we could go on and on. But,
I hear you, because there is still fault to be had on some of the candidates that were in the race, but there's a lot of fault to be had too with, in general, the media, right? Like, and how the media created the character of Donald Trump, right? And they had a responsibility to tell the truth, and they didn't. And so the fact that they're doing it now, 3.5 years into his, first term, to me is just like, I guess better late than never, but not really.